41 American Rangers entered these jungles. Only 14 came back out. The rest simply vanished. They were not found in firefights, on minefields, or in traps. They disappeared as if the forest had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole, leaving not even a shred of uniform or a drop of blood for the search teams. The Pentagon reacted quickly and unusually. On the operational map, a thick red line was drawn across an entire district. Beneath it, in ink, 3 words were written: Australians only, prohibited to others. Australians, the very ones whose army was smaller in number than a single American division, and whose country is known more for kangaroos and desert than for military power. Yet it was to them that 17 square kilometers of the most dangerous forest in all of South Vietnam were handed over, territory where U.S. Marines and paratroopers were categorically forbidden to set foot. What these Australian operators did in those mountains was so effective and so terrifying that American liaison officers, after joint patrols, began writing reports requesting immediate reassignment. One Marine major returned from a patrol and submitted a 2-word report that was immediately locked away in the most secret drawer. The 2 words were, "We're children." Now you will learn why the most powerful army in the world quietly handed over a piece of jungle to 132 men from a country many Americans could not even find on a map. And by the end, you will understand why the Viet Cong stopped calling them soldiers. They began calling them something else: the ghosts of the Black Forest. 26 kilometers northeast of the main Australian base at Nui Dat rose a mountain range that the locals called the Black Forest. From the air, it looked relatively small, only 17 kilometers of limestone covered in dense, wet jungle descending toward the sea. American reconnaissance planes photographed every square meter. Strategic bombers dropped more than 38,000 tons of explosives there between 1966 and 1969. Marines conducted several major operations in the northern approaches, yet the local Viet Cong regiment continued to operate from caves and tunnels as if the Americans had only come to admire the scenery. The Americans never understood one simple thing. The Black Forest was not a position that could be captured or destroyed. It was a living organism, a network of underground rivers, limestone caves, and tunnels that had been expanded and reinforced for more than 25 years. The Viet Cong did not merely hide in these mountains, they had become them. Every new tunnel was dug by hand, reinforced with bamboo and clay, entrances camouflaged so that even from close range they looked like ordinary thickets. Underground rivers were used to move supplies and people, while natural caves were turned into warehouses, hospitals, and command posts. All of this had been built over years, dating back to the fight against the French, and by the time the Americans arrived, the system was nearly perfect. This was only the first layer of the mystery that tormented American intelligence for the next 3 years. In February 1968, a company from the 173rd Airborne Brigade attempted a sweep of the eastern slopes. What happened over the following 96 hours forced the command to classify the entire operation at the highest level. 41 Rangers entered the forest. 14 came out. The rest did not die in the usual sense. They vanished. Their bodies were never found. Their names were added to the lists of the missing, which haunted families for decades. One of the survivors later told a small circle that he heard his comrades simply stop responding on the radio. No screams, no shots, only silence. And then, emptiness in the airwaves. The official report attributed the losses to enemy action and difficult terrain. But the classified assessment, circulated only among senior intelligence officers, told a different story. The Viet Cong did not fight the Americans. They hunted them, slowly, patiently, one by one, pulling men out of patrol lines without a single shot. Sometimes they left clues, a broken branch, a shifted stone, to lure the group deeper into the trap. Sometimes they simply waited until a man stepped into the bushes to relieve himself and took him like a shadow. It was then that the command made a decision that remained buried in secret archives for more than 40 years. The Black Forest was declared completely off-limits to all American ground forces. But the problem remained. The Viet Cong regiment continued to strike at Allied positions, set ambushes on supply roads, shell bases. Someone had to deal with it. That is when the Australians arrived. To understand why the Pentagon entrusted a task that 25,000 American soldiers could not accomplish to a force of fewer than 500 men, one must understand how the Australians fought in Vietnam. The first Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy province in 1966 with a completely different mission from the Americans. While the U.S. measured success by body counts and captured territory, the Australians were given one goal: to fully pacify the province by any methods they deemed necessary. The key word was any. They were not bound by strict rules of engagement, not required to report every shot, not forced to count bodies for statistics. They were simply told, "Make it quiet here." Within this force operated a unit that barely appeared on American organizational charts: the Special Air Service Regiment. 3 squadrons rotating through, never more than 130 men in country at any time. Officially, reconnaissance. In reality, something far older and far more merciless. These men did not see war as a contest of firepower. They saw it as an art of patience and fear. Captain Richard Hargreaves took command of the 3rd Squadron at the beginning of 1969. A former crocodile hunter from the Northern Territory, he had survived his first real hell in the jungles of Borneo in 1965. What he learned there, tracking gorillas through thickets where visibility never exceeded 2 meters, turned him into a man the Viet Cong had never encountered. He could read the forest not with his eyes, but with his entire body, by changes in air humidity, by the sudden silence of birds, by the barely perceptible movement of leaves in a breeze no one else felt. But the real secret was not him, but the men under his command, and especially one group whose existence the Australian government denied for decades: the Aboriginal trackers of the Australian Army. Private First Class Elijah Mungu was from the Yolngu people of the North. He was recruited through a program that officially did not exist. His ancestors had survived in the harshest conditions on Earth for 60,000 years, developing senses that Western science still cannot fully explain. Mungu could follow a trail through jungle where American thermal imagers saw only green mush. He could determine the age of a footprint by the moisture in broken grass with accuracy to within 4 hours. He could smell rice and fish sauce from 350 meters downwind. He knew when a man was tired, when wounded, when frightened, simply by how he placed his foot or how he breathed. For him, the jungle was an open book, and the Viet Cong were merely animals to be studied before being taken. When Mungu arrived at Nui Dat in May 1969, the American liaison officer, Major Paul Webster, laughed at the whole idea. Aboriginals tracking humans in the jungle? It sounded like a 19th century museum piece. 19 days later, Webster was already sitting in a helicopter writing a report requesting urgent reassignment back under American command. He had seen something he could not explain to any superior without risking being thought insane. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, we must understand what made Australian operations so different. The Americans hunted the enemy, fixed him in place, and destroyed him with overwhelming firepower. This formula worked in Europe, in Korea. But in the triple canopy jungle, it had one fatal flaw: you cannot destroy what you cannot see. The Viet Cong understood this perfectly. They had studied the Americans for years. They knew they moved in large groups, made noise, followed schedules, called artillery and air support at the slightest threat. So the forest became their greatest ally. All they had to do was wait. The Australians turned everything upside down. Americans patrolled in companies and battalions. Australians, in groups of 4 or 5. Americans burned jungles with chemicals and napalm. Australians slipped through them without moving a single leaf. Americans arrived by helicopter with loud radio chatter. Australians walked dozens of kilometers on foot, set up ambushes, and waited in complete silence for days. They could spend a week living only on what they found in the forest, without lighting a fire, without leaving traces. They learned to sleep in 20-minute shifts, so someone was always awake. They learned to breathe so quietly that even insects did not notice them. But the biggest difference was not in tactics, but in mindset. Australians did not see themselves as soldiers fighting an insurgency. They saw themselves as hunters. And in hunting, there is no concept of fair fight. There is only prey and the one who takes it. The first time Major Webster truly understood this was on August 22, 1969, when he went with a 5-man group into the northern spurs of the Black Forest. What he wrote in his classified report reached General Abrams' desk. The group left Nui Dat at 3 in the morning. They covered 10 kilometers through rubber plantations, then entered the jungle. Webster immediately noticed: no talking, no visible signals, no sound. The commander communicated by touch. A light press on the shoulder meant stop. A touch on the elbow meant turn. The movements were so subtle that Webster missed half of them. He felt blind among the sighted. By dawn, they had covered 14 kilometers and lay in wait overlooking a trail junction that intelligence considered a supply route for the Viet Cong regiment. The ambush was unlike any standard one. They dug no foxholes, set no fields of fire. 4 men simply melted into the bushes on either side of the trail. The 5th, Mungu, crawled forward. For 25 minutes he studied the ground, face almost in the dirt, sniffing, touching leaves with his fingertips. Then he returned and whispered something to the commander so quietly that Webster heard nothing, though he stood a meter away. They shifted to new positions, movements slower than moss grows. 13 hours later, 5 Viet Cong couriers walked down the trail. They never knew what hit them. The lead man stepped on a pressure plate. A directional mine detonated. 4 seconds. 5 bodies. 0 Australian casualties. The sound would not have carried beyond 40 meters. But that was not what shook Webster. What shook him came afterward. American doctrine said strike and withdraw. The Australians stayed. Another 7 hours of observation. At 1640, a search party of 11 arrived. They found their comrades seated against trees, eyes open, weapons across their laps as if resting. In each collar was tucked a small piece of red cloth cut in the shape of a lotus flower. Webster watched from 50 meters as terror paralyzed them. One dropped to his knees and vomited. Another opened wildfire into the shadows, emptying his magazine. A third simply stood frozen, staring at one spot. They grabbed the bodies and fled, in complete disorder, abandoning weapons, leaving tracks any rookie would consider shameful. The Australians did not fire. They simply watched. In his report, Webster wrote one sentence that later circulated through classified channels. The Australian Special Air Service does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare, using enemy bodies as the medium of communication. And he added personally, I request not to be included in any further joint patrols. I do not wish to see again what they do. But this was only the beginning. The real horror unfolded in the fall of 1969, during reconnaissance of a major complex deep in the Black Forest. Intelligence indicated a regimental-level headquarters, field hospital, warehouses sufficient for 6 months of combat, training camp for recruits. The Americans said, impossible. Too deep for bombs, too dangerous for helicopters, no spare troops. The Australians decided otherwise. Not to destroy, to map. Every entrance, every exit, every trail, every movement, every habit. 5 men inside the enemy's security perimeter for up to 4 weeks. Over 5 months, 23 long-range reconnaissance patrols. They brought back thousands of pages of data, tunnel layouts, patrol schedules, weapon storage sites, even daily routines of commanders. But more importantly, they sowed fear of the unseen. Soldiers heard a twig snap, went to investigate, found nothing. Patrols that had been safe for years began losing men without trace. Captured Viet Cong regimental diaries later showed a unit sliding into collective paranoia. 3 did not return from water detail. No blood, no tracks. Political officer says deserters. Commander thinks otherwise. Post number 5 reported movement at 2 in the morning. Illumination flare. Nothing. At dawn, the sentry was found with his throat cut. Neighbors 12 meters away heard nothing. The knife entered so cleanly that blood did not even splash on the ground. Movement now only in daylight. Request for reinforcements from neighboring regiment. Denied. Area considered secure from Americans. They did not know the real threat was not American. The threat was 5 men who had learned to hunt from those whose ancestors had tracked prey for millennia before the first cities rose. Mungu identified 21 habitual trails. Like animal runs, the Viet Cong followed out of routine. The Australians did not block them all. They selected 5 key ones and turned them into killing grounds. Strikes were random, then disappearance. Sometimes 1 out of 10, sometimes 1 out of 20. They never got greedy. The goal was for fear to grow faster than confidence. Victory was not measured in body count, though the ratio reached 18-1. Victory was in the broken mind. By February 1970, the Viet Cong regiment holding the Black Forest ceased offensive operations. Men were intact, weapons functional, supplies adequate. But the will to fight was gone. They were hunted by an enemy they could not see, understand, or defeat. They began believing in spirits, in curses, in the forest itself taking revenge for intrusion. Why did the Australians succeed where the Americans failed? Not in technology, not in numbers, in philosophy. Americans believed more firepower equals more victory, more bombs, more soldiers, more helicopters. If it isn't working, add more. Australians came from a different tradition. Small wars, colonial policing, frontier survival, Boer War, Malaya, Indonesian confrontation. In each, they learned the same lesson. Patience, fieldcraft, and psychological pressure achieve more than artillery barrages. They knew you can kill the body, but if you break the spirit, the enemy is defeated without another shot. They moved through the jungle the way a man moves through his own backyard, confident, calm, almost proprietary. That was what the Americans could not replicate. Selection for the Special Air Service began not with physical tests, but with psychological screening. They looked for men with iron endurance, no need for approval, animal-like pattern recognition, and the ability to remain motionless for hours, then explode into action in fractions of a second. 1 in 12 made it through. Then 18 months of training, 3 times longer than U.S. Green Beret training of the era. Much of it took place in the Australian outback, learning from Aboriginal instructors whose knowledge was never written down. They were taught to read rain tracks, determine direction by the smell of wet earth, recognize when an animal fled in panic versus when it moved calmly. They were taught to kill silently. They were taught to wait. They removed the soles of their boots and glued on tire rubber cut to resemble Vietnamese sandals. From a tracking perspective, they did not exist as Australians. They became part of the forest and the psychological warfare. Every kill was a message. Bodies were arranged as if the man had seen something supernatural in his final moments. Hands folded in prayer, eyes left open, weapons placed so it looked as though he had tried to fight off a ghost. A small piece of red cloth in the shape of a lotus, because in local beliefs the lotus is tied to souls that cannot find peace, to transitions between worlds, to things that cannot be explained. Sometimes they killed no one at all. At night they entered camps and left signs, footprints that appeared from nowhere and led nowhere, equipment rearranged while sentries slept, messages carved into trees in the local dialect. We see you. Once they left an empty American tinned meat can in the center of a camp. Inside lay a tooth from one of their own men who had disappeared a week earlier. Morale cracked. Desertions rose. Night patrols were refused. Before entering cursed zones, elaborate rituals with incense and prayers were performed. Political officers shouted about betrayal, but their voices grew quieter. By the summer of 1970, the Black Forest had become Australian territory. Not because the Viet Cong were eliminated, they remained in their caves, but their spirit was broken. Psychological dominance, something the Americans never achieved anywhere else in Vietnam. The price was high. Those who learned to hunt humans in those mountains did not simply return to normal life. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans were higher than among their American counterparts, even though they served in smaller numbers and suffered fewer casualties. What made them unstoppable in the jungle made them strangers at home. Many could not sleep without a light on. Many flinched at the sound of rain on the roof. Many saw in dreams the faces of those they left sitting against trees with open eyes. The final American assessment of Australian methods was not completed until 1976, 5 years after the last Australian combat troops left. Classified, distributed to fewer than 40 people. Its conclusions overturned everything. Small elite teams achieve more than massive operations backed by overwhelming firepower. Indigenous trackers provide intelligence no technology can replicate. Psychological operations break the enemy more effectively than bombs. And most controversially, the Australians succeeded in part because they operated without the restrictions imposed on American forces. Certain practices involving bodies and signs would have been considered violations of the laws of war if conducted by Americans. The Pentagon buried the report. It was inconvenient to admit that their most effective allies had won partly by doing things their own forces were forbidden to do. The political implications were too dangerous. The moral implications too heavy. But stories like this refuse to stay buried. Today, special operations forces around the world study Australian methods from Vietnam as a benchmark of unconventional warfare. Trackers, long-range patrols, psychological pressure, all of it is now part of training curricula. But the psychology is hard to copy. You can replicate the movements. You cannot replicate what turns farmers, hunters, and stockmen into ghosts of the forest. Private First Class Elijah Mungu returned in 1971 and never served again. He lived among his people in the north. When historians asked him to speak, he answered, "That knowledge belongs to the forest. Let it stay there." Captain Richard Hargreaves remained in service until 1986. His lectures on jungle warfare are still required reading at the Australian Defence Force Academy. He died in 2013. Part of his contribution remains classified. And Major Paul Webster returned to the States, finished his career in special operations, and never spoke publicly about the Australians. His reports lie in archives, silent testimony to a war one military did not want to adopt and another did not want to acknowledge. The ghosts of the Black Forest are gone, but the mountains still remember. Sometimes, in the rainy season, local peasants say they hear footsteps where no one is walking. Sometimes they find old red lotus shapes tied to branches. Sometimes they simply feel eyes on their back and quicken their pace. The forest does not forget, and it does not forgive.